Mike Holrich's lecture entitled Creating a Christian Culture, Eusebius of Caesarea, Globalization, and the Empire. The lecture is a part of Theology Department's lecture series, New Frontiers in Theological Research. As the title of our series suggests, the aim of the series is to discuss new ideas and to share the fruits of faculty research with our students and the general public. Professor Hollerich has for 20 years been a member of Theology Department's team of church historians and historical theologians. At St. Thomas, he has taught courses in all periods of church history, on the history of the papacy, recently in the news, religion and politics, and the German churches in the Third Reich, as well as more sections of Theology 101 that he can possibly remember.
True.
He tells me that he wonders whether they give out frequent flyer miles for giving your 100th course. Besides teaching in the Theology Department, he has offered courses in the Catholic Studies, in the Murray Institute, and in the School of Divinity. He holds an undergraduate degree in theology from the University of Notre Dame, the Master's of Theological Studies degree from Harvard Divinity School, and a doctorate from the University of Chicago, which, if you ask me, is the best of all possible worlds. In Chicago, he studied with such lights as Robert Grant, Arnaldo Mamigliano, and Bernard McGinn. His main area of research is early Christianity. Professor Hollerich is an internationally recognized authority on Eusebius of Caesarea, which is the subject of today's lecture. Professor Hollerich's monograph, Eusebius of Caesarea's Commentary on Isaiah, Christian Exegesis in the Age of Constantine, published by Oxford in 1999, has considerably expanded our knowledge of Eusebius by its extensive treatment of Eusebius's little-studied commentary on the book of Isaiah. Professor Hollerich also has a strong secondary interest in modern German church history. He has recently published a translation of German patristic scholars Eric Peterson's Theological Tractates, and that was with Stanford in 2011. Now, included in the collection of Peterson's is landmark essay of Peterson on the ancient political theology, the essay entitled Monotheism as a Political Problem, which shows how ancient writers, pagans, Jews, and Christians justified earthly monarchy by its parallel with the monotheistic belief in one divinity in heaven. And so watch for this particular point in today's lecture. Professor Hollerich is also a co-editor with Dr. Catherine Corey of the third edition of Theology Department's textbook, The Christian Theological Tradition. By my count, roughly about 1/5 of that volume was actually written by Dr. Hollerich. Dr. Hollerich has just been awarded a prestigious University Scholars Grant to do a book on the reception of the work of Eusebius of Caesarea and the role of Eusebius in shaping the Western cultural tradition. Now, as you can see, years and years of scholarship and profound reflection are behind the public lecture that you're going to hear today. Now, he tells me that tonight's lecture was originally meant as a summary of his forthcoming book, but that instead he's going to try to explain why his subject is an important one in the first place. Would you please welcome Professor Hollerich?
I hope you recognize a cover story when you hear one. The topic tonight, even the title, is a little bit of a cover. I'm going to substitute universalism for globalization. The ancient world didn't know that word. We invented it. I didn't check this out, but I'm guessing in the last 75 years or so, maximum. Universalism is certainly a word that Eusebius would have recognized, and for him, pairing it with empire was unnatural. These were complementary terms that, in his mental universe, went together. I'm going to put up on the screen here a passage from his Life of Constantine, which is a book that I will get to in the last third of this presentation. I'm not going to read it through, it's too long, but it can be there as a sort of a visual aid for you. And it's a passage from Book 2 of Eusebius's life of Constantine, describing the atmosphere as Eusebius presents it. He certainly owned a very big pair of rose-colored glasses, of the situation after the Council of Nicaea, held in 325. And while I'm talking, there won't be anything else up on that screen for quite a while yet. That's my idea of a visual backdrop. You can cast your eye over it, and themes of universality and monarchy are rife through it. The real prize winner for that, by the way, is a speech that he gave on the 30th anniversary of Constantine's reign, but that text isn't going to get into the talk tonight. I'm going to begin. Since the Second Vatican Council, Catholics have often talked about living in a post-Constantinian era. We like to say that we're done with empire in any sense that word's been used in the past. On the other hand, we can't say the same thing about universalism and Christianity's universalist claim, even though it's obviously a problem how to square that with the facts of religious pluralism and religious freedom, not to mention that one of those other religions makes similar and therefore competing universalist claims. But I think historical and theological honesty requires us to recognize that Christianity began as a converting and proselytizing religion that was open in principle to all. Jesus' final words in the Gospel of Matthew, "Go and teach all nations," are a command to take that message everywhere. They sound like a starting gun in a race. I've often wondered, even in recent years, whether Christianity might have invented the very idea of a single religion for all human beings. And if that isn't a thesis to throw out for argumentation, I'm not sure what would be. I'm prepared to take heat for it. And that everyone since then, Mani, Muhammad, Marx, has been using someone else's playbook. Now, to turn to the person who's the focus of tonight's talk, that's all background for why I think the subject matters. Eusebius of Caesarea was born between 260 and 265 and died 339. He's, I believe, of lasting importance to Christianity and Western culture generally because of his extraordinary literary production and also because of the time in which he lived. He is our most important witness to Christianity's transformation after Constantine's conversion in 312 AD, when Christianity ceased to be an illegal religion and began its rapid rise to state establishment, a journey that Eusebius enthusiastically endorsed. Unlike many writers of the early Christian period, however, he isn't Saint Eusebius because he ended up on the wrong side of the Arian controversy. He lived most of his life in Caesarea, which was the capital of the Roman province of Palestine. He's actually known to history as Eusebius Pamphili, meaning the son of Pamphilus, a name he took out of gratitude and respect for Pamphilus, a rich and learned Christian presbyter, priest, who had started a kind of Christian research center in Caesarea. Pamphilus's work was focused on building a great library, the core of which were the books left by Origen of Alexandria, died 253, who, along with St. Augustine, is the most brilliant and creative Christian thinker of the early church. Origen, unfortunately, is also not Saint Origen, because his many writings, you're seeing a pattern here, generated intense controversy, culminating in his condemnation 300 years after his death at the Fifth Ecumenical Council in 553. Origen was already controversial when he was still alive. A conflict with his bishop drove him from Alexandria, his home, and from his position as head of the Christian school there. Origen packed up his library and accepted the invitation of more open-minded bishops in Palestine to move to Caesarea in 232 or thereabouts, and he spent the rest of his life there. To understand Eusebius and his books, we need to know something first about Origen, since Eusebius saw himself as Origen's protege and advocate. At the core of Origen's theology was the belief that our universe was the byproduct of a higher spiritual world from which it had emerged and to which it would return at some point in the future, perhaps a distant point. God the Father existed from all eternity and was connected with the created world through his Son, God the Word, in Greek, the Logos, who was God's agent in creation. As all students of Theology 101 know, Logos can mean reason as well as word. An educated reader of the Gospel of John would have identified God's Logos with divine reason as the spoken word, as well as the spoken word. Calling God's Son divine reason was a link with Greek philosophy, according to which the intelligibility of the world and the human capacity of reason were both divine endowments. To Christians educated in philosophy, it was easy to see, for instance, that the picture of the world given by Plato and the Platonic tradition, in which the lower material world participates in the true being of the world of the forms or ideas, as compatible with Christian ideas of the goodness of creation. Sin and the fall came about when the rational beings whom God had created lost their focus on God and fell into the world of time and change. Because God was good and because he ruled the universe with his providence, eventually the rational beings would have the divine image in them restored, and they themselves restored to the heavenly world. And in the words of St. Paul, God would be all in all. Though Origen was willing to say this might take more than one lifetime and perhaps more than one world. Among the ideas that got Origen into trouble were his speculations about the possibility of universal salvation and also about the pre-existence of souls. Eusebius took this universal cosmic optimism and he historicized it. We could even say he politicized it. Eusebius was interested in the long process stretching back to the creation in which God's plan to restore the fallen human race was being worked out. Compared to Origen, his books say far less about what existed before our world or what will come about after it, and much more about the time in between. But his Origenist heritage shows through in several ways. In his belief in the universality of the process of redemption, meaning that it embraced the whole world. He didn't endorse Origen's speculation that all might be saved. He didn't share that one. In Eusebius' interest in tracing the progressive triumph of the Logos as divine rationality made flesh, first in Christ and then in his followers, and in his belief in God's providential dispensation of the whole process, finding God's hand in history. What the Second Vatican Council will call the signs of the times. That is a red thread running through his writings. Eusebius' education began in Pamphilus' library, cataloging the books and copying and correcting manuscripts, especially manuscripts of the Bible. It was here that he found the primary sources, quotations from which play such an important role in his books. And it was here that he learned the respect for sources and the technical scribal skills necessary for the care and reproduction of manuscripts. Eusebius became a junior partner with Pamphilus in the management of the library and a co-author with him of an apology on behalf of Origen. When Pamphilus was martyred in 310 during the Great Persecution, Eusebius took over the whole operation. Over the next 10 or 12 years, he wrote most of his important books. Also during that time, he became the Bishop of Caesarea and a major public figure in the Christian church, especially after Constantine gained control of the eastern half of the Roman Empire in 324. By the time he died in 339, he'd become an ecclesiastical elder statesman and the most respected Christian scholar of his day. My presentation is going to focus mainly on three of his historical writings: his History of the Church, his Chronicle, and his Life of Constantine. I have to pass over his great apologetic works, and I can't say much about his biblical scholarship either, which is too bad, not just because it's the subject I know best, but Eusebius, along with just, because it's too bad, because Eusebius, along with just two or three other early Christian writers, Origen and Jerome among them, has a right to be called one of the fathers of the Christian Bible. We may take the Bible's existence for granted, but scholars know how complex and contingent its formation and its preservation really were. Eusebius had a crucial hand in preserving the Bible as a physical artifact, thanks to the manuscript copying in the library at Caesarea. Constantine would later put in a book order for 50 complete Bibles for the churches in the new Eastern Roman capital in Constantinople. Eusebius also helped determine what went into the Christian Bible. He's a primary witness to the process by which the canon, the list of the biblical books, was determined. And he pioneered in the serious scholarly interpretation of the Bible by carrying on the practice of writing line-by-line commentaries on the individual books, following the example of Origen before him, and designing useful tools in biblical studies. Pagan critic, one of his works, his Gospel Sections and Canons, was a comparative synopsis of the Gospels that allowed you to look up passages, understand how difficult it was when you only had scrolls with no chapter and verse divisions. And if you wanted to do a comparative study of the Gospels, it was no easy task. And Eusebius designed an ingenious system of cataloging all the sections of the four Gospels and then showing which ones were duplicates of one another or had parallels. Pagan critics of Christianity who studied the Gospels like to point out that there were contradictions and inconsistencies. Eusebius is one of the first Christian writers to write specialized studies that compared the stories of Jesus' birth and of his death and resurrection. You may have noticed that there are some interesting contradictions in the details at both the beginning and the ends of the Gospels. Such work was made easier with the help of his table of parallels, and it was so successful that it accompanied translations of the Gospels into other languages for centuries to come. Christians had a lot of explaining to do where their scriptures were concerned. Their Old Testament, as you know, was first the possession of the Jews. Pagans were aware of that too. Christian scholars were always trying to convince Jews and pagans alike that the Jewish scriptures had foreseen Jesus and were therefore rightly the property of Christians. A further problem was that the Bible, whether in its Jewish or its Christian version, recounted God's revelation to a particular people in particular times and places. And with the exception of a few passages in both the Old and the New Testament, the Bible to educated readers seemed ignorant, if not downright hostile, to the rational spirit of Greek philosophy. It was, and of course still is, a major problem that a revelation that claims to be for the whole human race should have appeared in human history as the property of one particular people in the human race. Defenders of Christianity, the writers that we call the apologists, devised various strategies for responding to the accusations of uncouthness and unfairness. The doctrine of God's Son as the divine Logos, who gives light to all human beings, was one such strategy, and Eusebius certainly used it. But he liked historical arguments better. A favorite tactic was claiming that Christianity was older than other religions. He and other Christians who used it borrowed it from Jewish apologists. This might seem like chutzpah, since Christians naturally had to argue that they were the real heirs of the Old Testament in order to backdate themselves all the way back to the creation. That is how Eusebius begins his greatest book, his History of the Church, which was produced in stages between 311 and 325, ultimately consisting of 10 books stuffed with documents and quotations that make it tough reading for students and a goldmine for scholars. Eusebius starts not with Jesus' birth in the flesh, but with his work as the Logos, through whom God had created the world and revealed himself to human beings. He wrote, "Ever since the first man was created, all who are said to have been distinguished for righteousness and purity of their religion, the great servant Moses and his companions, and before him Abraham, the very first, and his children, and all the righteous men and prophets who have since appeared, they recognized him in visions seen with the pure eyes of the mind and paid due honor to him as God's Son. He, for his part, showing no slackness in his veneration of the Father, made himself for all mankind the teacher of the knowledge of the Father." Close quote. The original pure religion of humanity for Eusebius then looked like a kind of universal ethical monotheism, and Jesus' incarnation was the occasion for its republication and spread outward to a human race that in the meantime had fallen away from its pure beginnings. The history of the church then tells the story of the next 3 centuries in which Christianity spreads to east and west. Eusebius knows about a spread of Christianity beyond the eastern border of the Roman Empire, and he even passes on traditions about the Apostle Thomas's mission to Parthia, Rome's great imperial rival. We have to look at other ancient sources to learn the traditions about Thomas's visit to India. He doesn't tell us about that. But his narrative is basically the one that's patented by Luke in the Acts of the Apostles, in which the gospel travels from Jerusalem westwards to Rome. The political backdrop to that narrative is the Roman Empire. But the narrative, Eusebius's narrative, lost my place. In Eusebius's telling, the empire is God's instrument to pacify the world for Christianity. The Pax Romana made the world safe for the Prince of Peace. It was one of those signs of the times that Jesus was born in the reign of Caesar Augustus, under whom war and polyarchy, ruled by many, gave way to peace and monarchy. The Roman Empire's persecution of the Christians, Eusebius explained away by saying that it was only bad emperors who persecuted, not good emperors. The 9th and 10th books of the history of the church tell how Constantine would end the last and greatest of the persecutions. Eusebius has great fun telling how his victory over his imperial rival, Maxentius, is a replay of the Exodus story, with Constantine as a new Moses and Maxentius as Pharaoh. The 10th book ends with documents illustrating Constantine's alliance with the Christian church. Most famous among them is the so-called Edict of Milan in 313, granting universal religious freedom to all. More telling are the ones that show Constantine as already a strong supporter of the church, like the one that extends tax exemption to the clergy. Later Roman emperors had to cut back on that one because there was a flood of vocations as families wanted to put the money in safekeeping. In return for, the reason why the clergy got tax exemption was in return for their intercessory prayers on behalf of the empire. Constantine had no doubt about the power of prayer. Or the document in the church history summoning the bishops to a Western council in Arles in southern Gaul in August 314 to solve numerous problems then afflicting the church. Constantine's precedent in calling that council will establish the rule that it was emperors who convened councils. Popes would not assume that role until the split with the Orthodox churches hundreds of years later. One of the canons or rules from Arles that I should note is number 3, which appears to excommunicate Christian soldiers who throw down their weapons in time of peace. This represents the first statement that I know of on the church's teaching of the duty of military service as opposed to the dangers of it. But I can't let Constantine take center stage yet. I need to say a bit more about why Eusebius' history represented something new and lasting. His book presented Christians with what today we will call a grand narrative about Christianity's origin and development. Eusebius' word for that was orthodoxy. In his telling, the Church of the Apostles was a pure and spotless virgin in which everyone was on message until the church's pure teaching was corrupted by the heretics. If it's true that the winners write history, how much credibility can Eusebius' narrative have? He certainly shed no tears for the losers. Thanks to modern discoveries, like the Gnostic texts at Nag Hammadi in Egypt, we know a lot more today about how diverse early Christian belief and practice really was, until a growing universal church structure, soon to be aided by a Christian Roman Empire, succeeded in enforcing a degree of uniformity on a famously argumentative and divided movement. Eusebius wrote his history, or most of it at any rate, before the empire really got involved. He certainly defended the apostolic authority of the bishops as guardians of the true faith. But his real criterion was the teachers of the faith, and they weren't all bishops, whose writings he quotes constantly. The appeal to literary evidence is the crucial feature of his book, and the crucial element in his defense of the emerging canon of the Christian Bible. He knew very well that not all disagreement was inspired by demons. A major theme in the history of the church is Eusebius' defense of Origen's orthodoxy. He gets one whole book to himself, Book 6, which was already under intense attack in Eusebius' day. Another theme in the history of the church is Eusebius' ideological war against millenarianism. Millenarianism refers to the 1,000-year earthly reign of Christ with the saints, as recounted in the book of Revelation. In Revelation, the Roman Empire is said to be an instrument of Satan. Christians experiencing persecution sometimes retreated into ancient hopes of Christ's early return and the imminent defeat of the powers of evil, i.e., the Roman Empire. Eusebius found everything about millenarianism objectionable. Its materialist dreams of an earthly paradise, its dependence on myth, and, of course, its politics. He does everything he can in his history of the church to show that the book of Revelation doesn't belong in the New Testament canon. Opposition to millenarianism was also behind the second book of Eusebius' that we're going to profile, his Chronicle of World History. Eusebius called it chronological canons because it consisted of comparative tables of all the national dynasties he knew of. His bright idea, and it seems that it really was his invention, was to put the ruler lists of the various nations in vertical columns next to one another so that a reader could compare events in one nation's history with what was happening at the same time in other nations. You can imagine the work that went into this. First, he had to compile the raw data. For that, he used national histories in narrative form, ruler lists, plus a list of Olympic victors. He also used the Bible and Jewish and Christian chronographers before him. All of his sources were written in Greek, even those that had to do with Assyrian, Egyptian, or Roman history. All of that information he summarized in a separate book called the Chronography. Then he had to plot the tables themselves, which were constantly changing as nations rose and fell. Eusebius says he tabulated the royal successions of 15 nations in all. The maximum number that appeared on any one page was 9. As new nations were added, they bumped existing ones to the left. At the end, only one kingdom was left, and that was Rome. Between the tables of numbers, he had to leave room for adding historical notes. For the first portion of the canons, he used 2 facing pages for each set of synchronized tables, with each page having a blank column in the middle in which he wrote out items of historical interest. And this is one scholar's reconstruction because we do not have the original. One of the great editing feats of the 20th century was Rudolf Helm's edition of the Chronicle, the work behind which you would not believe, and the 150 years of controversy over the manuscripts that preceded the publication of Helm's book, which the University of Minnesota has, the actual book, so you don't have to read it online. Eusebius also needed an absolute chronology against which to align the national lists. He used 2. One from the Bible and the other from the Greeks. His chronicle began with the birth of Abraham in what we know as 2016 BC, and counted forward by marking each decade. He also counted by Olympiads, the Greek system of keeping time in 4 units, which begins in 776 BC in our reckoning. And this is the first page of the Chronicle. So we have here, by the way, it's in Latin because the Greek original is lost, and St. Jerome, thank goodness, made a complete Latin translation, and then continued the story for another 50 years. Here we've got, this is the Hebrew column, the beginning of the column that will record the lives of eminent figures in the Bible, starting with the birth of Abraham in what we consider 2016 BC. Over here, you can see the Roman numeral 10. He didn't count each year in the era of Abraham. He counted every 10 years, and we know that he did this. The modern editor has imitated it. In order to make this visually accessible to the eye, he underlined every number that was parallel with that particular decade of an era of Abraham. So we get Roman numeral 52, we get Roman numeral 10 over here, Roman numeral 31 over here, and Roman numeral 10 over here. This last column, the Egyptian column, dynasties of the Egyptian pharaohs. This page is the page on the Chronicles on which dating by Olympiads also begins. And here, it also happens that this is the page, a part of the Chronicle where he had the maximum expansion. And from left to right, your left to the right, you can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 national histories that he was able to synchronize. The second and the third ones are both for the Jews, the Hebrews, because by that time, as you may remember from your 101 class, the northern and the southern kingdoms had split after King David and King Solomon unified the 12 tribes, and so Eusebius dutifully followed both north and south. Over here on the far left, you can't read it, it says Medorum, which means of the Medes, and one of the features of the Chronicle was that the far left column was always given to the current world empire, and he counted 5. Assyrians, Medes, Persians. He calls them Alexandrians. He means Alexander and his successors, and of course the Romans. One other thing to point out about this page, down here, it says in Latin, I'm going to read Jerome's Latin translation of Eusebius's Greek. It says, from this time, the first Olympiad, which I repeat, we date to 776 BC, the Greek history, Graeca Historia, the Greek history is creditur, believed creditur vera. It's true. Before that time, he thinks there's a whole lot of myth and legend, but the Olympiads gave him what he thought was a solid structure on which to continue the dating. Okay. Now, 2 questions to ask about this whole thing. Why did he do it? And did he succeed? Well, to the second question, if you're talking about impact, the answer is he certainly did. Even though the original's gone, unfortunately, it inspired, we do have chunks of it that are survived in Greek. It inspired continuators in Greek. It spread to the east in Armenian and Syriac translations. We found an almost complete version of it in Armenian in the 19th century. And to the west in Jerome's Latin translation. And Jerome's version has survived in 100 medieval manuscripts. Did he succeed in terms of accuracy? Well, that's more complicated. Garbage in, garbage out. Some of his sources weren't as good as others. The errors that crept into this by the continual copying and translating of the text produce more errors. So it is a scholar's nightmare. It is, however, still the fundamental chronological structure on which dating of the ancient world is done to this day. We can't do without it, even though it's hard as heck to work with. And I'm just learning. Don't ask me too many technical questions I'm not sure if I can answer. Why did he do it? 3 purposes. One was apologetic. Eusebius wanted to show that Christianity in its Jewish embodiment before Christ, was older than the great events and figures of Greek history, older even than the gods, who Eusebius thought were just divinized human beings. Earlier Jewish and Christian writers had made similar appeals to the greater antiquity of the Bible, but Eusebius really enriched the argument. He made Moses the central figure before Christ and showed, to his satisfaction anyway, that Moses preceded the Trojan War by 375 years, although he admitted that that was only half the priority that Christian and Jewish predecessors had tried to claim for Moses. He thought they were wrong. Another crucial reference point was the rebuilding of the Jewish temple after the return from the Babylonian exile, which Eusebius placed in the second year of the reign of the Persian king Darius and the first year of the 65th Olympiad, or 520 BC, in our reckoning. And here's that page. Eusebius, in his introduction to the canons, Eusebius stressed how important that particular date was because it allowed him to correlate biblical Old Testament history with secular history. He was able to tie up Persian history with biblical reckoning. And a major change in the format of the canons shows its importance. From that point on, he is only going to use one page for each passage in time and not 2 pages. Unfortunately, this is still a 2-page format, and I did not make a slide for the next page. But after that, it's an individual pagination. A second goal of the canons was to derail efforts by earlier Christian chronographers to create a chronology that would anticipate the end of the world. You think that that's only a recent preoccupation? Christians have been doing it probably from the beginning. According to one such calculation, the world was expected to last for 6,000 years, followed by a seventh that would be the biblical millennium. Jesus was said to have been born in the year 5500, halfway through the 6th millennium, which meant that the expected end could not be far off. I've already mentioned Eusebius' hostility to millenarianism. His canons begin their chronology with Abraham rather than with creation or the expulsion of Adam from paradise, because Eusebius didn't think biblical chronology before Abraham was reliable. He says, neither from the Greeks, nor from the barbarians, nor from any others, not even from the Hebrews, can one learn with security the general chronology of the world. That eliminated the neat millennial scheme. Besides, says Eusebius in his introduction, didn't the Lord himself say, it wasn't our business to know the times or the seasons that the Father has set by his own authority? The third purpose of the canons was to organize a universal human history, in which biblical history was only one part. He wanted to combine into one grand scheme both biblical and secular history. That is implied by the fact that the leftmost column, as I said, was always dedicated to the leading world empire of the time. Eusebius counted 5 such empires: the Assyrians, the Medes, the Persians, and the Alexandrians. Immediately to their right came the Hebrews. The column of historical information on that page dealt with events in sacred history. But even the Hebrews disappear as a separate column after the Babylonian captivity because they lost their independence. When they finally regained their independence after the Maccabean revolt, they reappear on the far right of the tables as just one more secular kingdom among others. Their sacred political history is over. They disappear for good in 70 AD after the failure of the Jewish revolt of 66-70 AD, and the only kingdom left is Rome. The column of historical notes now included events of Christian history, including the succession of bishops of Rome, Jerusalem, Antioch, and Alexandria. Eusebius' picture of world history set down in column after column of cold-hearted numbers. History is just one damn thing after another. Thus leads up to and concludes with the last world empire of the Romans. The canons ends in 325 AD With Constantine's unification of the Roman Empire under his sole rule, the 20th anniversary of his reign, and the Council of Nicaea. And right here in tiny Latin, it isn't tiny in the book, but it is up here, sorry, Eusebius wrote, if Jerome translated him accurately, here to this point, Eusebius ends, Eusebius of the housemate, I can't, had a little trouble with the Latin, Martyris Conturbalis, of Eusebius Pamphili ends, to which I have now added Ista, the rest. And Jerome went on for another 53 years to take the story up to 378, to his own time. All right. Having come back to Constantine, we can now look at the third of Eusebius' works, his Life of Constantine. Here, the themes of universalism and empire are front and center. Eusebius began the book immediately after the emperor's death in 337. It still wasn't finished when Eusebius himself died 2 years later. It was completed by the successor bishop in Caesarea, we think. Although it's called On the Life of the Blessed Emperor Constantine, it isn't exactly what the ancient world would have expected in a biography. Nor is it just a long funeral panegyric. It's a hybrid of the two, with hints of hagiography thrown in, where Eusebius sees Constantine as the saintly servant of God. He is Theophiles, the one who loves God and who is God's friend. Quote, alone among all those who have ruled the Roman Empire, he became a friend of the all-sovereign God and was established as a clear example to all mankind of the life of godliness. Eusebius starts out by comparing Constantine with great predecessors like Cyrus and Alexander. That's what a panegyric for a dead emperor was supposed to do. But then he veers away from secular models and turns to Moses, in whose career Eusebius finds lots of parallels with Constantine's. It goes on for several chapters. Just as God, who is gracious to the oppressed, raised up Moses as a leader for his people, so too he's raised up Constantine to liberate God's church from her oppressors. As I've already mentioned, Eusebius loved to see the Exodus as a model for God's action in history. He might be the first liberation theologian. Some of my friends don't like hearing that. A different kind of liberation theology gets written after the revolution. The life of Constantine continues on this split secular and sacred track by giving some of its attention to conventional imperial topics like war and legislation, but more to Constantine's special deeds as a Christian emperor. Eusebius, of course, had no precedent for that, no Christian precedent, and that may be one reason why he went back to Moses for comparisons. As a Christian emperor, Eusebius shows him leading prayer sessions in the palace, composing and delivering sermons, convening councils, passing legislation, building and endowing churches in Jerusalem, Antioch, Constantinople, Rome. He built the original St. Peter's, the one we know was a 16th century replacement. Repressing paganism and inventing the Christian version of holy war. All of this prior to his baptism, which he delayed until his deathbed. Not all modern historians believe this picture of an enthusiastically Christian Constantine. In fact, it's only in recent times that historians have agreed that the life of Constantine really is by Eusebius and not by somebody else. It's also recognized today that the documents he cites, remember that documents were a big part of the history of the church too, they're genuine and not forged. In my opinion, Eusebius' picture of a firmly Christian Constantine is basically correct, but it's also very selective in what Eusebius tells us and what he leaves out. Unsavory details, for instance, like his execution of his wife and his oldest son, not to mention most of the rivals who stood in his way. In the time that I have left, I want to show how the twin themes of universalism and empire dominate Eusebius' picture of the first Christian emperor. Let's start with two famous passages in which Eusebius says Constantine compared himself to a kind of bishop with oversight. Remember, that's what the word bishop means, episkopos, somebody who has oversight, a superintendent, oversight of everyone, Christian and non-Christian. The first one reads, "To the church of God, he paid special personal attention. When some were at odds with each other in various places, like a universal bishop appointed by God, he convoked councils of the ministers of God. He did not disdain to be present and attend during the proceedings, and he participated in the subjects reviewed by arbitration, promoting the peace of God among all." And the second one reads, "Hence it is not surprising that on one occasion, when entertaining bishops at dinner, he let slip the remark that he was himself perhaps a bishop too, using some such words as these in our hearing. You are bishops of those within the church, but I am perhaps a bishop appointed by God over those outside." In accordance with this saying, he exercised a bishop's supervision over all his subjects and pressed them as far as lay in his power to lead the godly life. Bishop here is obviously just an analogy, but it's an analogy with some big implications. The most important exercise of this quasi-episcopal oversight in the church is this convening of the Council of Nicaea to resolve the Arian controversy and also to settle disagreements about the date of Easter. We're still not able to agree. Yes, famous. The oldest argument in Christianity is, when do you have Easter? Constantine wanted uniformity of cult even more than he wanted uniformity of belief. Eusebius says that the letter of convocation which the emperor sent to the bishops summoned them to an ecumenical, meaning a universal council, in Greek, synodos oikomenike, which is the first occurrence of this term in Christian literature. You have to remember that until 325, the Christian churches had never met as a body that could claim to speak for all, if you accept the passage in Acts chapter 15 in the Council of Jerusalem. There was no universal voice that spoke convincingly for everybody. It's a fact worth pondering that no such universal organization existed until a Roman emperor created one. The reason for that may be that no one else had the muscle to make universal decisions stick. The price of dissent now meant imperial deposition and exile. In coming centuries, it could mean imprisonment or death. Outside the church, the most striking example I can think of has to do with the war with Persia that Constantine was planning at the end of his life. Rome and Persia were the superpowers of the late ancient world. The world's two shoulders, like that image, the world's two shoulders, as a Persian Christian church council once put it. Their spheres of interest touched one another across a long frontier stretching from the Caucasus to Arabia. The previous 2 centuries had been marked by non-stop border wars and intermittent truces. In 314, the king of Armenia converted to Christianity. Armenia had been a traditional dependency and ally of Persia's. Now it was becoming a client of Rome, and a Rome ruled by a Christian emperor. That set Persian nerves on edge. To traditional Roman imperialism, Constantine added the powerful new incentive of a religious mission. In the prologue to the life of Constantine, Eusebius had emphasized the universality of his ambitions. After celebrating Constantine's acquisitions in the west, north, and south, Eusebius writes, and I'm going to read this, this is from the beginning of the life of Constantine. He did not treat the acquisition of what lay in the Orient as beyond his scope, but illuminating with beams of the light of true religion the ends of the whole inhabited earth, there's that word oikomene again, oikomene, as far as the outermost inhabitants of India, and those who live around the rim of the whole circle of earth, he held in subjection all the toparchs, ethnarchs, satraps, and kings of barbarian nations of every kind. These spontaneously saluted and greeted him, and sent their embassies with gifts and presents, and set such store by his acquaintance and friendship that they honored him at home with pictures of him and dedications of statues. And alone of emperors, Constantine was recognized and acclaimed by them all. For his part, he used imperial addresses to announce his own God openly and boldly, even to the people of those lands. In that last sentence, Eusebius may have been thinking of a letter that Constantine sent to the Persian Shah, Shapur II. The letter's undated, but it has to come from after Constantine's unification of the empire. Eusebius says it was written in response to a Persian embassy to Rome. It begins with a religious testimonial. Under the sign of Christianity, Eusebius says, or Constantine says, he has raised up the whole world, oikomene, step by step with sure hopes of salvation. In return, because God, quote, also values highly righteous empire, God guards the imperial mind with the calm of peace. And just as God rewards the righteous, he punishes the wicked. Constantine's victories over the persecutors of his own time are further proof that God means to use pure and excellent religion as the means of unifying and saving humanity. Then the letter gets to the point. Constantine knows that there are Christians, my whole concern being for them, living in the most important parts of Persia. And so Constantine recommends them to Shapur's care, which he tells the Shah will bring satisfaction to both of them. To which Eusebius adds this: thus, finally, all nations of the world being steered by a single pilot and welcoming government by the servant of God, with none any longer obstructing Roman rule, all men pass their life in undisturbed tranquility. The universalism in those words is rooted in a long tradition of Roman political panegyric. Here is how the 2nd century writer Plutarch, pagan writer, had described the universal ambitions of Alexander the Great. Quote, he wanted to make earthly affairs subject to a single rational standard and to a single government, and to demonstrate that all human beings were a single people. Close quote from Plutarch. Christianity could claim to give even greater sanction to imperialism by adding the supreme benefit of salvation. Constantine's language may have been peaceful, but there was no missing the implied threat. He was putting Shapur on notice that Persian Christians were under Constantine's protection. In the decade of the 330s, he engaged in a series of military moves on the eastern frontier that seemed to have been provoked after Shapur removed the Christian king of Armenia and replaced him with a Persian appointee. Constantine then decided to lead an invasion of Persia. Hardly had he started before he became ill and had to be brought back to Constantinople, where he was finally baptized and with a fine sense of timing passed away on Pentecost Sunday. He was buried in a new mausoleum dedicated to the holy apostles, where his tomb was set amidst 12 cenotaphs. That's an empty tomb that doesn't have an actual body in it. In a semicircle, Eusebius describes the floor plan of the church, with his tomb in the middle, making him de facto, I guess, the 13th apostle. The war he was preparing to fight had all the trappings of a holy war. According to Eusebius, he discussed the preparations for his campaign with the bishops at his court. He asked some of them to go along in order to provide for divine worship. They said they would soldier with him and fight at his side with supplications to God. A tent was built as a kind of mobile church for conducting religious services in the field. Before the invasion, a trip to Palestine was planned so that the emperor could fulfill his dream of being baptized in the River Jordan. The threat of holy war had unhappy consequences for Persian Christians, some of whom seemed to have hoped for a Roman victory. No sooner was Constantine dead than Shapur launched a retaliatory attack that began a generation of warfare that didn't end until 363. Shapur also began a severe persecution of Persian Christians that lasted on and off for the rest of his reign. In the Acts of the Persian martyr Simeon, bishop of Seleucia Ctesiphon, that's the winter capital of the Persian kings, right next to modern-day Baghdad in Iraq, when Simeon refuses to impose a double tax on Christians in order to pay for the war against Rome, Shapur is made to say, Simeon wants to make his followers and his people rebel against my kingdom and convert them into servants of Caesar, their co-religionist. In the next century, Persian Christianity would eventually break communion with Roman Christianity, thus beginning the long history of what we call Nestorianism as a separate and competing global version of Christianity that reached as far south as India and as far east as China. Those Thomas Christians that say they were founded by the Apostle Thomas were certainly Nestorian Christians. It will only be the first of more schisms to come, provoked by Christianity's entanglement with its political host, the Roman Empire, and then with its successor states. So to finish, I tried tonight to give you some sense of how Eusebius envisioned Constantine's universal triumph, Christianity's universal triumph, a triumph won in close partnership with the Roman Empire. That empire is long dead, but it's left its mark on Christianity. It's a nice coincidence that this lecture occurs as the Church is electing a new pope in a city and in a setting that inescapably recall the Roman Empire. It's a question worth asking just how much unneeded imperial baggage our Catholic Church has brought along with it in its long pilgrimage through time. It's also a question whether the Church has really reconciled itself to living without an actual empire as a partner. The Second Vatican Council said firmly that yes, it has. I sometimes wonder about that, but maybe we can leave that to discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Hollerich, for a phenomenal lecture. You've certainly raised the bar of future lectures very high and certainly whetted my personal future appetite and interest for your book on Eusebius. We have about 20 or so minutes for Q&A. And so we have two microphones on the right and on the left. And so just feel free, please, to raise your hand and we will give you the microphone.
I want to ask this question about the chronologies.
Yeah.
It seems to me that there's a burst of interest in chronology, again, shortly after the Reformation, with Bishop Ussher and Scaliger and many others.
Yeah.
I thought I'd read at one point that they were trying to finish things off by taking that gap in the last century before Christ fulfilled it. But it seems from what you said that Eusebius had already attempted. So what's new in the right after the Reformation that they're trying to do that he hasn't already done?
Well, the problem was that they knew that they didn't have the original. There were fragments that had survived in other Greek translations, or continuations, I mean. But the original was gone, and it was the discovery in the 18th century of an Armenian translation that triggered a whole wave of new interest. Scaliger, Ken's referring to a 16th century, who was the first person to once again take up this kind of chronological work. A great question, and because my book project is going to be about the reception of his writings, that's the kind of question that I'll have to look at to see when and why people pick up the discussion again. I can't give you a great answer except that the stimulus of discovering a translation that looked like it was most of the original, including the excerpts that was the first volume. Jerome didn't translate that. Most of it survived in Armenian. So that stimulated the work. But the Rudolf Helms's edition is the kind of scholarship that makes you want to genuflect and respect because of the talent and the work that went into it.
Is Eusebius the earliest source for the compilation of the Gospel of Matthew?
No, oh no, that would. There is a early second century writer named Hegesippus, who wrote 5 books of memoirs, I think he calls them. But Eusebius preserves what pieces of it are left. If only he quoted more, you know. We don't think he forged stuff, but he only quoted selectively. And I think it may be in Hegesippus that the earliest references are found. The statement that says that Matthew's gospel was first written in Hebrew and probably meaning Aramaic, and that everybody translated as best they could. My New Testament friends say there was never an Aramaic Matthew. Why are we so sure about that? I don't, so I think Hegesippus and then Irenaeus, Papias, I'm throwing out names here. I'm early 2nd century. I thought somebody might want to take on my statement at the beginning about Christianity inventing the idea of a single world religion. I mean, I started saying this in class. I don't expect an undergraduate to contradict me, but it might be obviously wrong if you think about Buddhism, and I don't have a good answer to that. But it just.
I have another question actually on your final point on how imperial Catholicism is.
Yeah.
I'm a little more optimistic than you are. I mean, if we look at these last 4 weeks and a half, I mean, up to the conclave, this debate that we had, or that some people had about the opportunity to have a pope coming from the United States and the reluctance to accept this idea. I mean, even coming from U.S. cardinals saying we shouldn't have an American pope. It seems to me that the Catholic Church now conceives itself much more as an anti-empire, much more than an empire. And this is one of the big problems that we have. I mean, it seems to me that the 7 centuries after Eusebius, we had this need of the Catholic Church to be associated desperately with an empire. I mean, after Gregory the Seventh, we have this. I mean, impulse to become. I mean, counter empire, because you cannot be an empire anymore, and so you need to pose yourself as an anti. So this is why I think that.
Would you have been so optimistic prior to a couple of days ago?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure how hard I would want to press this. Maybe it's watching the obsession with promotion and rank and governance. A full disclosure to you undergraduates, your professors also look for stuff on Google, and so when I was trying to recall a famous or infamous quote about the Catholic Church, I went and Googled it and found out how wrong I was. Here's the quote: "The papacy is the ghost of the Roman Empire sitting crowned on the grave thereof." Now, that was no friend of the Catholic Church who wrote that. I thought it might be Edward Gibbon or possibly Thomas Babington Macaulay or some 19th century historian. You know who it was? Thomas Hobbes in Leviathan. Yeah. What I was playing with in the thematic structure of this talk is that Christianity is a universal religion. This is in our charter, as it is in Islam's charter. What God has ultimately in mind with this, if you believe in providence, God has allowed all this to happen. What God has in mind in all this, we're still working out, but we can't back off from our claim. It's just that claim has historically been tied. I'm trying to find the right modifier. Inevitably, I really wonder how well we would do without some kind of empire. We're headed for interesting times in the church with a Latin American pope. This is really extraordinary. It's wonderful.
This appears in the Quran as there is only one religion with God. That is submission, that's surrender. And that has always been from Adam up to now. So, and all the prophets were giving just the same message, the same submission calling. They were, what I'm intrigued always with the Christian history, I see, as far as I can understand correctly, the question of identification of that religion with God, with a particular history, with a particular empire, with a particular moment in history. That identification, that I think there seems to be a disagreement. In Khilafah, for example, in Islamic Khilafah, which is the political kind of structure, political, Muslim scholars have always criticized, and they put that the rule or the will of God must be supreme over any particular Khilafah or empire. So there's not that identification, as far as I can see, as strongly we see in Eusebius and others.
I'm just learning about Islamic history. And I want to say, my first full-time teaching job was at Luther College. Some of you may know, a fine liberal arts college, where I was the only Catholic in the religion department. And I enjoyed the job very much, but I left after a while because I was just feeling the burden of somehow being the answer guy, the person to go to talk about a 2,000-year-old religion with 1 billion members. And ever since, it's given me fresh appreciation for the strain, the difficulties, and the challenges of occupying a comparable position. I don't know enough to make a comparative answer, Adil. Is the caliphate, doesn't the caliphate correspond to this? Was the Ottoman Empire the last, how serious were Ottoman claims to be a true caliphate? The Persia didn't accept them, right?
They were Arabs, of course.
Yeah. Yeah.
In Spain and in Baghdad.
Yeah.
So there were different centers. And then Seljukids and then Ottomans, they continued this. But they were, the image is never that they said, oh, we are representing the will of God, or we are representing God. That identification. Because always there were the religious body, they always stood as body to criticize them, to call them to God.
Well, Christianity certainly has its version of dualism, clearly. This is the relations between church and state, which Massimo was just referring to. Maybe by starting with Eusebius and Constantine, in some ways, you'll never again in Christian history see that kind of imperial monopoly of church life. It was maybe an unrepeatable moment. Maybe it's a good thing it was an unrepeatable moment. So I might be exaggerating how typical its significance is. I still think that it becomes a template that others aspire to. And I cannot debate with you, but I would be surprised if in Islam that the caliphate is not a template that Muslim rulers aspire to, and that it's pretty comparable to the imperium that Christian rulers in the Middle Ages, and even in the modern period, the czars, of all the Russias.
What do you know about Eusebius's travels to Rome? Did he frequent?
Nope.
Or he did
never,
not.
Never went there. In fact, the only travels that I know of are a trip to Egypt that he took during the persecution. But if all you knew about early Christianity was Eusebius' history of the church, Rome is out there. It's important. He has the succession of the bishops, but he's pretty poorly informed about it, and it's part of a Well, it's one player among several. I don't.
So was Constantine well traveled? Did he come into the area himself, or was Eusebius learning about this by messengers mostly?
Oh,
Or
well, if Timothy Barnes is correct, Eusebius oversells dramatically how much face time he had with Constantine. Barnes says that he thinks he only met the emperor 4 times in actuality. They certainly had contact, and when Eusebius says he was in the emperor's presence and heard him say something, I'm going to give this credibility that he did not make up the event, and they're dramatically misrepresent what the emperor said. But by then he doesn't meet him until the emperor moves east. When Constantine unifies the empire after 324, he has remarkably little contact with the western part of the empire then, because the business part of the empire was always in the east. That's where the population was, that's where the wealth was, and that's where the greatest military challenge was on the eastern frontier with Persia.
so, excuse my ignorance. Was he a Roman citizen? Or
Oh, sure.
okay,
Of course.
so
Yeah,
but then did he was appointed by which pope then, or he was?
Eusebius?
Yeah.
The popes were not appointing bishops
At all, okay.
in very many places, anywhere within 30 miles of Rome in the 4th century.
So were he did have his own apostolic succession in that particular
yes.
region?
The reason why Eusebius, he has in the Chronicle and then in his history, he has the succession of the bishops in 4 places: Rome, Jerusalem, Antioch, and Alexandria, and he regularly records them. Those bishops are elected, though. They're all elected by their clergy with the acclamation of their people. Nobody's appointed.
I mean, today, roughly speaking, when we look at our time, there is a kind of dominant political, economic, social system that sees itself that it should spread to the globe. There's globalization. So one system,
Yeah.
one social system.
Yeah.
Then any other alternative system is not not really allowed. Sounds like would be a target. So in the empire, in the Roman, during the Constantine's time and the Roman Empire, would that be something like when Constantine accepted Christianity and made it a state, an imperial religion?
Yeah.
Would that mean that it should make the whole earth a Christian, so that fight all religions? I mean, was that the ideal?
Well, first of all, Eusebius is overselling just how much actual change Constantine was able to make. Christianity does not become the state religion of the Roman Empire in any real sense until the end of the 4th century. This is only the initial stages on the way, and it's difficult to disentangle rhetoric, imperial rhetoric, from actuality of what was seriously envisioned. But the rhetoric is pretty striking. There is not much doubt that the Roman emperor's power projections are global, and that they are now sanctioned by religion. The words on the page say that. How seriously should take the rhetoric? That's another matter, and that's you have to really parse the language carefully then. But this war with Persia that didn't happen, it's really interesting that these are the two world empires before Islam, the 2 world empires in conflict for centuries. But it's only from the 4th century that religion becomes an important part of that. Zoroastrianism in Persia and Christianity in the Roman Empire. There are Christians in Persia, but they never become the state religion because the Zoroastrians won't yield power to them. the reason why I ended with an historian's is because, and this applies to Islam too, part of what made the Arab conquest possible was that millions of Christians on the eastern edge of the Roman Empire who were considered heretical or schismatic by the emperors after the Council of Chalcedon, that their alienation, without any doubt, made the Arab conquests easier because the emperor in Constantinople was their persecutor. The people that we call Monophysites, I'm referring to, people who did not accept the Council of Chalcedon, were hostile to imperial Constantinopolitan Christianity because they didn't accept their dogma of Christ. So the entanglement of the empire with doctrine may have eased the path to the Arab conquests. Yeah, it also helped, of course, that Persia and Rome had exhausted one another like two fighters who were just worn out.
Yeah, I would say, not to monopolize, but I think what we read, our history, Muslim history, Caliphate, and later on, as more of a separation of the political structure than the religious claim. So it's clearer.
Yeah.
It's not that really combined.
I think there's a fair amount of stereotyping that goes on here because I myself would have said the opposite about Islam vis-a-vis Christianity. But I speak from ignorance and I'm being candid about it. Yeah. Yeah. Two reasons. Nobody says so in so many words, but there are two pretty clear reasons. One was political. The Christians were a minority in the empire, and becoming too openly Christian might have entailed political risks. The era of persecutions had just ended, and so that was certainly, caution and prudence played a role. The other was moral, because the penitential system of the early church was so rigorous, with confession, reconciliation being extended only once after baptism for serious sin, an emperor was expected to do all kinds of things that at that juncture he might have had moral reservations about, and so deferred his confession. We all know that St. Augustine's mother did not have, Monica did not have Augustine baptized at birth, for I think the significant reason is recognized that she wanted to not let him spend all his capital right away. We do know that when he was baptized, it was by another Eusebius of Nicomedia. If you are lucky enough to go to Rome, you should go to the Church of the Four Crowned Saints, Quattro Coronati, and put your euro into the box inside of a side chapel there, if the nuns will let you in, and lights go on, and you can see a fantastic series of frescoes of the donation of Constantine, 13th century visual illustrations of the legend that Pope Sylvester had baptized Constantine and cured him of heresy in the bargain. But one of the puzzles about the life of Constantine as a book is that it was not translated into Latin. Unlike the church history, which was translated instantly into Latin, the life of Constantine was not. And one of the things I want to find out is why. I'm not sure why.
It's amazing that he wrote the book and he hardly knew the man,
Well, he was a speech writer. Panegyrists, when they were writing, they would often do that. They might check some things out, but a lot of it was formulaic, so that there were things you were expected to say, things you weren't expected to say. It's maybe not an accident that he waited until he was dead to write it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming today. Our lecture series will continue next year. If you have questions to ask the speaker, feel free to stay after the lecture. Let's now thank the speaker again for the wonderful presentation.